purification process is going inward and doing the work that is required of us to identify the light from the dark elements within us and working towards altering the dark within us towards the light so that we can change that balance so that we become more and more and more moving towards the light than we are literally towards the middle road, so to speak, here, where we've got equal amounts of both. We want to start becoming more and more compatible to higher and higher realities rather than being stuck here in the worlds between good and evil. We want to move to the worlds of light. We want to graduate. The awakening phase, often for many souls, will start out with positive experiences. We are often taken into these positive experiences to get us more grounded and ready to deal with things that are going to be more intense further down the path. What can sometimes happen, and this is one of the important things during the awakening period, is that it's important not to think that when you have your first experience or your first, whether it's an out-of-body experience or if it's some other type of spiritual awakening, because people sometimes have different types where it comes to them in different ways, that what you have seen or what you have experienced is all that there is to know. And what sometimes happens, because people don't realize, okay, you've touched that tip of that iceberg. I remember the first time I had it was probably my second or third out-of-body experience beyond what I had at the age of 9. When I first started having them at the age of 22, it was like the second or third. I'm like, wow, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I know? How could anyone know? There's so much. I could not have fathomed how much more was coming. So it's good to have that hindsight of knowing there is always going to be more. And now, I've had so much now that I know that there's always more, that God is too big for any of us as human beings to comprehend. So there's always going to be more. And so we can only speak to that which we've seen. In the awakening phase, a lot of times it will be very positive. There are some people who have some experiences that are different. That none of it is exactly the same across the board, but there are some, these phases that I describe are pretty similar to what people will go through. A lot of what happens in the awakening phase is the beginning stuff. You experience being out of your body, and then you also learn how to experience vision, sight, smell, hearing in the consciousness rather than the physical body. Then you have to learn things like, how do I move? And then how do I move through physical objects? All of these things require some training and trial and error. And then you start learning more, like you do a little bit around the astral plane, and then you start learning about corridors, and so you're going to start there. A lot of times people will start in the awakening with past life memories and things like this, and you're going to start also with your initial teachers. Whatever your initial teachers are going to be, my initial ones began about the concepts of oneness, and that was with a teacher that I had named Emmanuel, and that's not the same as Jesus. He was a different Emmanuel. and it goes on to different teachers. And so that's a lot of what happens in that primary awakening phase. Co-creation is when you're learning a lot about how creation itself works and how we work in co-creation with God. And we also find out a lot about the creative spirits and the types of creative energies that are around us individually for the type of work that we are going to be involved in. So if you are a creative person, like writer, painter, artist, musician, all those kinds of things, there's all kinds of realms where creation originates from, and these kinds of things will be introduced to you. But if you're like a scientist or a mathematician, that's a whole nother sphere of it. Whatever your particular sphere of vocation is in life, it will have a corresponding place of training where you're going to receive the creative energies that come from God and where it will be enhanced. It's a really exciting time because there's a lot of really fun things that you get to experience and see, and there's a lot of acceleration during that period, tons of acceleration, because it's all about getting you primed in your gifts. So there's a lot of that going on. Lots of vibrational raisings during that period, and lots of really cool, beautiful realms you get to visit, because these are the realms of creation. This is beautiful places. I remember going to like the planet of the Assisi Marauders and the Temple of the Dolphins, the cloudy realm where the different musicians were practicing their instruments, crystal cities in the skies. That was also when I went to the Crystal Forest, which has the crystal rivers and the trees with the crystal leaves. I mean, come on. That's a time of great beauty. You're just seeing the spectacular. That's when I was also introduced to my white-winged horse. His name is Saint Harmony Crystal Fire. Wow, one of those memorable times. I would get to go out of my body, my white-winged horse would be waiting for me, and I'd get to fly to the planet of the Assisi Marauders and learn about how creation works in all sorts of little molecular ways. Oh, it was so awesome. Just lots of really neat things in that period. Lots of really cool things there. There is a big period there where you literally are learning how to surrender to the spirit, because when you're learning about creation, you're finding that there is a flux of energy where there is impetus and then pulling back, impetus and pulling back, and that's the surrender. And so when you're in the time of impetus, you have to discipline yourself to be doing exactly what God is instructing you to do, the inspiration of what you need to do. But then when that phase has passed, then you go into the surrender, where you have to surrender and allow the energy to do its work. And that applies as well to what's happening in your soul. This also happens in your out-of-body travel experiences, where you're going to see that movement. So you're pulling forward, you're pulling back, you're pulling forward, you're pulling back, pulling forward, you're pulling back. And so you're learning how to surrender to the spirit. There are actually a lot of rituals that you go through to learn how to release your own control of the mind in the moment so that God can take over. And it's interesting because when I was back doing those things, you're out of your body, you're in your spirit, you're stationary, you have a teacher who is telling you, I need you to surrender, I'm going to teach you what to do, and I'm going to do this and this and this and this, and I want you to just surrender to what I'm doing. You go through these different phases of it, but when you actually reach that moment where you surrender to God, literally what happens is it's like fall back and soar, because you're literally falling into the arms of God. That's what surrender is in the spiritual journey, is allowing God to do it. And so we have this tendency as human beings to have a real hard time with surrender because we're control freaks. So the surrender process can be something we have to go through some training on, but it's really beautiful. And you do go through different levels of it that continue well beyond just that third phase there. It continues throughout. But it is a beautiful thing, because that moment that you reach it and you do it, it's literally like you fall back and all of a sudden you're soaring through space. It's amazing. The initiations into the mysteries, you are taken into this mysterious energy that goes deep beneath what you've experienced to this time. And you're being taken into what would be signs, symbols, mysterious times in history, mysteries of different religious paths. I was taken back to these initiations into the Sphinx, and what are the mysteries behind the Sphinx, the Garden of Eden. There is so much to be attained. You're continuing again with the past life retrieval. And what you're going to be moving towards near the ends of the initiations is when these past lifetimes come together as one, and you are uniting with your higher self, where your higher self is able to kind of descend into you, your higher self being the highest aspect of you. And then you're allowing this higher part of yourself to operate through vibrational raising into your body. And then you are bringing together the knowledge of all of your lifetimes into one place, into your current moment. And it's just such a powerful period, because you're traveling forward and backward in time. You're going into ancient temples and being shown mysteries of all sorts of things, Egyptian mysteries, Christian mysteries, ancient Greeks, and galactic mysteries, which will unfold even more later. It's a beautiful time, a very poetic time, which is part of the reason why the language changes in Passage to the Ancient, because it's just, you cannot speak of it in mundane language. You have to speak of it differently. You just do. That's when the karmic issues that you have been instructed about and seeing and reliving and remembering start hitting the ground. So these things start happening around you. Things from previous times begin to repeat themselves around you, and you start learning about the mysteries of karma. There is so much delusions that surround those past lifetimes that ended in vain, so to speak. You did not find your way, and you have to try to understand these things, and they become manifest. It's a difficult period because you have to literally live in this world, but you cannot just live in this world. You have to also bring that understanding from the mystical realm, the worlds of truth, into the worlds of delusion. Otherwise, you will not progress. And it's very easy to get lost there, because again, the same habitual patterns will be placed before you, and habits are habits. So it's very easy to fall into old habits and do what we've always done, but you're being challenged at that point to do something very different, and to view it very differently, to understand it very differently, to literally go into it molecularly, so that you will take it apart this time to understand it and do it differently in a way that will provide literally resurrection for yourself and for everyone who's involved. It's complicated and it's difficult because of the fact that you're learning to bring what you're experiencing in the mystical into the worldly environment. And it's made even harder by the fact that most of the time, those other people who are going to be involved in your karmic pursuits are not going to be awakened. So they're going to be doing this according to the way that they've always done it too. And so you can't assume that they're going to be like, oh, hey, yeah, we're trying to figure this out. Let's do it. Hey, they're going to be doing the same things that they've always done. And you're trying to handle it yourself from this new awakened place differently. But you have to recognize that they're not necessarily going to be doing it any differently, because they may be coming completely from the same place. So it's difficult. It's challenging. You're challenged by the complicated relational aspects that you're faced with, because you're relearning everything about, well, what is the proper way to handle these things. And we're dealing with issues of the misunderstanding of the true nature of love, eternal love, the misunderstanding of the true nature of destiny, the right use of destiny, where people get lost, where people take the wrong paths, where people do things that are inappropriate, that cause literally aborts in other people's paths. And you're trying to navigate this from a much higher perspective and alter things, and you're trying to do it without anyone else's help most of the time, because our own awakening is our own awakening. We cannot assume that other people are always going to be on that awakening path with us, especially those who have traveled the karmic pathway with us. It's just not very often the case. I can't say it's never the case, but it's not very often the case. So we have to do it, even though everyone around us may choose not to be, or may not be even capable of it. They may have no idea where you're coming from, because they may be completely on the ground. You start seeing in the people around you the things that you need to see in yourself. So a lot of examples are brought into your perimeter, where it's mirrored back to you stuff that you do not yet see about yourself. Again, self-delusions perhaps, or it doesn't even have to be all just delusions, but it can be things you don't understand or just haven't realized yet. And so you have to become more acutely aware. You become more acutely aware where you're paying closer attention when you see these other things. For instance, you see a behavior you might not like in someone else. You have to become much more acutely aware, where you can actually consider the possibility of, how is this behavior mirroring back to me? Is there something in this that I need to see that is going on within myself, that or something that I'm generating that's allowing it, or even something within myself that is similar to it that I don't realize, don't see. God places around us, in ways we least expect, opportunities for this mirroring back. The but for the grace of God go I, period, where we become compassionately aware of how similar we all are. We can all be very, very aware of the flaws of others, but not see that we're just exactly the same. It becomes a good humbling experience, but it's also an awakening thing that we see more of it. The more that we become aware of, the more we can do about what we become aware of. If we're not aware of it, we can't change anything. Part of the mirroring is becoming more and more aware, because as you proceed through purification, you're going to be working to overcome some of the things that you are recognizing through all of these processes, all of these phases, all of these things that are being brought to your attention. One of the things that happens in the out-of-body travel experience is that you're shown a lot of energetic truth about other situations, but also about yourself. So, for instance, a good example of this would be something I wrote about in Mysteries of the Redemption, where I got chastised about my use of words. It was something that I had to get chastised several times. It was brought to my attention. Energetically, it was presented to me where I could really see it energetically as an embodiment. And then energetically, it's also given to me to experience the actual real consequence of it. In several of the experiences that I had, it was shown to me to be a pool of rattlesnakes, just snakes. These things are brought to our attention. So it was brought to my attention. The energy of it is being given to me. I'm also given instructions about different texts, ancient texts I can read that will help me to become more aware of my words. And a lot of that was books on Lashon Hara and Recluse, which are from Judaism. And there's a book called Echoes in the Heavenly Court, which is by a Jewish rabbi. It's an excellent book on proper use of words. This was something that had to be brought to me. And there are lots of things, whether it was my issues with lust, whether it was my issues with losing my temper, overreacting, whatever. And these are the kinds of things that will be brought up. So as you're bringing these things to your awareness, these experiences are actually making you feel, taste, touch, and see literally your own sin. And you're understanding why it's harmful, why it hurts, why it harms other people, why it harms God. You know, all these things that are brought up. The ignition of the eternal flame cannot happen until we are starting to throw some of these things off. And so a lot of these things, we're trying to literally become white as snow. As it states in the Bible, we want to start removing these elements. And so has a lot to do with the balancing of the masculine and feminine energies within our souls. But it also has, it's like a second initiation into the mysteries. Fire is part of that process, the ignition, where it's being brought. There's all these different processes where it's being lit, because it's got to be lit. And you go through the psychedelics, all the things that have to do with the psychedelic eyes and the psychedelic this and the psychedelic that, because that has to do with the eternal. The psychedelic colors, that's another subject there, but but there is a lot of like working out of the final karmic thrusts in the ignition of the eternal flame, and whatever the blocks and restraints are to balancing out as both your masculine and feminine energies within you. There's a point in there where you realize that you have to become that which you seek in order to find it. That's a big part of that. But you're bringing together these parts of your soul that are not working properly together. There's all these rites, and some of it has to do with the Phoenix, some of it has to do with Saint Joseph, some of it has to do with Buffalo Calf Woman. In the writing of the books of the eights, the introduction to the golden angels and that whole thing, the past lifetimes of meeting the people that you've known in all your past lifetimes that you had to meet in the spirit in order to be able to ignite the eternal flame and fully understand it. There were a whole bunch of things in relation to understanding the elements of change being the only constant of the eternal. the ascension has to do with what happens when the soul reaches the point where death is no longer the place that we go when we are finished here. And I had this experience where I met the angel of the ascension, who wears a white robe, and his face is all light and it shows out, and his hands are all light. He's very, very, very intense. I painted him too, but he's similar to the angels of death in that the angels of death wear the black robe and they have the skeleton for the face and the hands, whereas the angel of the ascension has the white robe and he's all light. No features in his face, and his hands have no features, they're just light. And the angel of ascension came when I had reached that point where I had ascended beyond the point where I would need to return to this earthly place for those particular karmic issues again. That doesn't mean that I'll never have to come here for other reasons. That's all up to God. But that's what's happening, and you move into those rites of the ascension, which is very similar. You go into the book of the Eights, which has to do with the book of immortality, which is something that I received when I was going through the initiations into the mysteries, which was earlier. But you receive your name into the book of the Eights, and then the writing of the book of the Eights is part of the process of becoming immortal, which is not a physical immortal, it's a spiritual immortal. It's a spiritual attainment, not a physical one. I remember Ki. He was one of the masters, the rites of ascension, and his name was Ki. He would travel through all of these different realms, taking the complexity and bringing it back to simplicity. But it's the complexity is all of it. It's the whole karmic thrust. It's all the paths that you've gone on where you've gotten lost. But it's also all of this knowledge you've gained about these different religions, these different paths, these different mysteries along the way. And it's all of these things that you've learned about your soul and yourself and the things that you're trying to change and alter as you're going. And it's all coming back. You're realizing that everything that you have been seeking has been external, and you're bringing it back to the internal. And as you bring it back to the internal, it's going to then rise up again, because it's going to go back towards God. But this is the beginning phases, these first 8 phases, where you're still going from this karmic path, which is very external, and then bringing it back to the internal and realizing that everything you've been seeking outside of yourself is what you have to seek from within.